We all set with prep time? Okay.
Yeah, we're good.
Great. I just want to confirm before we get started. I have Head-Royce on Gov and Granite Bay on Op. Is that correct? Okay. And if you would just tell me who's speaking first on either side, that would be great.
I will be the first speaker.
I'm sorry, who said that?
I'm Richard Jones. I will be the first speaker.
Okay. And have it on Op.
I'm Stuti Shilat. I'll be the first speaker on neg. And Francis Kasuni will be second speaker.
Got it. So it looks like we have everyone. Unless you have any questions, I am ready to get started whenever you all are.
All right, cool. My time will start off time roadmap and go down definitions, weighing mechanisms in both of our assertions. My time starts now. I just want to say the resolution is this house prefers. Can you guys hear me, by the way? Sorry, just want to make sure. Can you guys hear me? Yes. Okay, I'm gonna restart my time. There we go. This house prefers a centralized government to a federal one. We are on the government side of this debate. I just want to put some definitions out there. Centralized government is one that with both executive and legislative power are concentrated centrally at a higher level, and federalism is a system of government in which the same territory is controlled by two levels of government, generally an overarching government, national government responsible for broader governance, and a smaller one, like a smaller subdivision, like states and cities, which govern issues of their own. And then prefer is to like one thing more than another, tend to choose. Our weighing mechanism is benefit for the country. That's pretty self-explanatory. Our first assertion would be unity. Centralized governments are more unified compared to federal governments. It has much more equality and consistency across regions since decisions are taken concerning the welfare of the entire country. Some examples of centralized governments are China, Japan, France, Spain, Georgia. Countries like this are efficient at pursuing high-level government goals due to this concentration of power, making it much easier to get things passed, get things done at a much, much more efficient rate than any federalist country would have. It's also much faster to get political reforms and policies changed when the power is concentrated. Like I said, it's much more efficient to make things happen. Like it's a shorter chain to go through, and this affects the people much better. Like if there's something needs to change, it changes much more efficiently than it would change in a federalist government. Another point is, or evidence rather, is look at Japan. Japan is super advanced in the future. Or not in the future, so to say, but they're one of the most advanced countries in the world. They have a centralized government which allows them to focus on innovation, which allows their people to focus on like producing for the country, making their country better rather than making themselves more money or doing other things that like knowing that something won't get passed. They are very aware of bills in Japan get passed super efficiently. That's why they've been one of the leaders in tech and whatnot for the last 15 some odd years, because they have these things, they change with the times. It's very efficient. Our second contention would be that federalist governments are in massive, or this is a block rather, but federalist governments are massive amounts of debt. Federalism allows for massive amounts of debt to be amassed by the country due to federalist countries all being consistent with capitalism. This puts a lot more stress on our citizens and takes away from the benefits to their country, such as we have POI.
Yeah, sorry. So going back to the Japan argument, so you talk about how Japan has a centralized government and that helps technology. Doesn't that just leave the rural communities behind when they're only focused on that industrial urbanization?
No, because that was just an example that Japan is able to be technologically advanced because of this, but Japan also has one of the best rural systems, so to say. They grow almost all the food they consume and produce. They've been doing this since 1940s. With that, that's also part of centralization. They have made all, like I said, they've made all of their food, they make all their money. Everything is beneficial towards that country, towards Japan. So this doesn't exclude like any rural people. This doesn't exclude anybody in cities. That focuses on the entire country. So back to my second point. Federalism allows for large amounts of debt. Like I said, federalist countries, like I'm sure they're going to say, is the United States of America. There's a Bosnia, Belgium, UAE, Mexico, India, Malaysia. All of these countries are in a massive debt deficit. Like all of these countries have more debt, a debt to GDP ratio over 100%, which is terrible for the people. This stresses on their citizens because they cannot focus on innovating. Like I said, they cannot focus on making or trying to better their country. They're focused on making money to survive themselves, to make more money because they're going to pay more taxes because their country is in massive amounts more of debt. Like if you want to compare some debt numbers, we have China, which is a centralized government. They are only in $6 billion from debt, and their GDP is much higher than that. They have a wonderful debt to GDP ratio as a centralized government. In the United States, one of the largest federalist countries, is an embarrassment to the debt to GDP ratio, with having over $35 trillion in debt to a GDP ratio, or 37 to a GDP ratio of 35 approximately, which means it's literally over 100%. We cannot pay back our debt even if we took all the money out of everything we own. This puts a huge stress on the American people. I'm sure, as you and I know as well, gas prices skyrocketing, prices of cars, houses, all crucial things for our natural life or for our life in America are skyrocketing. This makes it much harder to be a person that can focus on innovating and bettering our country. I just want to go back with my last few minutes and reassert and re-inform our first contention about unity. Like I was saying, I should have mentioned with the POI, but rural and city urban areas both benefit from this, which means the literal entire country benefits from a country being centralized. Like I said, China, Japan, there's other centralized governments, which I don't know, but those are my two examples I'm using mainly for this debate. And both of these countries are not only China, as I said, great debt to GDP ratio, and they're both one of the most advanced countries in the world. China importing a bunch of, I think 40 billion or 40% of Korea's entire export of chips is going to China to make more innovations in the technological world, which we've seen as of late. They've made supersonic missiles. They've gone and helped their space program get much more efficient, and they've done this on the turn of a dime. They weren't focused on space 10 years ago. Now they're focused on space, and they're back in space. They're back in the space race, so to say. And the U.S. has been focused with NASA for 60 years, and we've only gone to the moon once. And the only rover mission we've had took 30 plus some odd years to get into fruition. So, like I said, that's our main point: is unity and efficiency. The efficiency is key. It's much more efficient to run a centralized government than a federalized government. That's why, Judge, I heavily suggest you vote on the side of the government.
Okay, can everyone hear me?
Yep.
Yes, okay, great. So just a quick off-time roadmap. I'm going to go on the neg contentions, the neg case, and then I'll go into the aff contentions. Okay, great. I'm going to start my time in 3, 2, and 1. Hello, Judge. My partner and I stand on the firmest opposition of the resolution resolved. This House prefers a centralized government to a federal one. First, we want to define this House as a global institution, we're going to be taking into account various countries, not just the United States. First, we agree with the affirmative's definition of centralized government. We want to add on that in centralized governments, traditionally, states have no authority to pass their own laws. So the delocalized or localized bodies on the local level don't have the authority to pass their own laws. The central or national government traditionally orders the states to do almost anything. The federal government is a political authority that is divided between two autonomous sets of governments. So in the United States, we have a national government and then subnational governments or states. The framework in today's debate, we mostly agree on this idea of benefits, but also because this is a truth resolution, we're going to define framework as truth based on net benefits. With that out of the way, let's go on to the negations case, starting with the first contention being progressive policy. Change is lackluster at the national level in centralized governments, in centralized governments. The United States is an example of a federal government. If the United States had a centralized government, we would never get localized climate change policy passed. California recently passed a policy in order to effectively get rid of gas-powered cars and to see a transition effectively to electric cars. We would never have any sort of climate change agenda passed if we had a centralized government, where local communities and local governing bodies would have no power. There is a disproportionate concentration of power in less populous areas at the federal government in the Senate, at the federal level in the Senate. So we need states like California in the United States to be able to pass this kind of agenda. Under a centralized government, these kinds of states would not have nearly the same amount of power or the same amount of climate change policy as we have today. Let's go to the second point here, and that is low income interests. In China, and this is something that the affirmative brings up, but let's talk about China. China has a centralized government system where they currently reside over 4 direct controlled municipalities. These municipalities don't have the power to control their government. They basically cannot pass any laws. That means the central government is going to be making all of the decisions. As a result of this, rural cities in China have been left in significant poverty with no voice in politics. The BBC finds that rural China has historically been disproportionately taxed and also have received fewer benefits from the recent economic development and success of China. This means that the national government in China is so worried about the image and the innovative image that they've created, they leave behind these local communities. There's a wide gap between the wealth of the impoverished countryside and the booming cities. The innovation and the GDP that the affirmative talks about, that's a facade. The reality is that the rural China simply hasn't seen those benefits. The lack of good healthcare. There's a lack of good healthcare, education, and other services in rural areas, and this is incredibly important. The annual per capita disposable income of rural residents was 2,762 yuan, which is about $3,000 in 2006, compared to about 9,000 yuan for urban dwellers. So again, 36% of China's population lives in these rural areas. This means that this idea of innovation and GDP, this is only a facade. It's not actually helping a large sector of the Chinese population. In China's government, there is no single institution or formal mechanism in charge of integrating these important rural policies. This has resulted in significant amounts of Chinese people living in poverty because the federal or the national government simply does not adhere to the interests of rural areas in favor of urban ones. Go ahead.
But your party, would the U.S. not also have extremely high rates of poverty being a federalist country?
Okay, so what we're saying is that China has a significantly larger amount of people living in poverty because they don't take into account the fact that these rural communities also have problems. They're so concerned about this federal or this national image that they've created, they just don't have policies that help people in rural communities. Again, in China's government, there is no mechanism in charge of integrating these rural communities to create policies for rural communities. And that is not the case in the United States. Rural communities are accounted for. So again, let's go on to the next point, and that is of Japan. Japan's stock market has surged and there has been innovation. Luxury cars are selling fast in Tokyo after 8 years of economic stimulus under Abenomics. But that new wealth is concentrated in a small slice of society rather rather than broadly distributed, and data shows this. Japan has left rural communities behind and has failed to put more money towards the development of rural communities in favor of the technological growth of major cities. The Japanese rural population in 2020 was about 10 million people. They have less access to the quality of education, to healthcare, and there's disproportionate amounts of poverty. The same thing is happening in China and Japan. Rural communities are left behind, and wealth inequality is on the rise. But now let's go to the second point, and that is vulnerability to right-wing nationalism. This is our second contention. Britannica finds that Hungary is a unitary or centralized state. The European Committee of the Regions finds that the Italian Republic and the Republic of France are both unitary states in which the national government has total authority over provinces. These centralized unitary governments in Europe have seen a massive surge of right-wing nationalism and are seeing anti-human rights policies being implemented on a national scale as a result. The Atlantic finds that in 2020, a national law effectively removed any oversight and silencing any criticism of the Hungarian government, allowing Prime Minister Viktor Orban to rule by decree for an indefinite period of time. Democracy has effectively died in Hungary. Since then, the UN Refugee Agency discovered that the Hungarian government has forced the police to remove any refugees to the country to be mercilessly removed. 71,000 people have been removed from Hungary. Amnesty finds that Hungary adopted a homophobic and transphobic law in June 2021, banning access to those under 18 to material that quote, promotes or portrays divergence from self-identity corresponding to sex at birth or homosexuality. This new law violated the rights to freedom of expression, non-discrimination, and education. Since 2018, Hungary has been blocking ministerial level political meetings between NATO and Ukraine. Hungary's reaction to Russia's invasion of Ukraine has been half-hearted. They've not condemned Russia. Instead, Viktor Orban actually met with Putin to increase trade relations after the invasion. Ideologically, Hungary aligns with Putin's non-democratic regime. There has been this alarming rise of right-wing parties in Western European nations like France and Italy. The BBC in 2022 attributes this rise in right-wing nationalism and anti-human rights legislation to the limitations imposed by unitary and centralized governments. But now let's go on to the affirmative case. The affirmative brings up the idea of unity. They talk about, is that a POI?
I had a question.
I can't take it. It's protected time. I'm sorry.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
I'm going to keep going. So to their point about unity, they talk about efficiency. They talk about the concentration of power, and they talk about Japan. That's their main example about the super advanced community. Again, this point completely is demonstrably problematic because they completely leave rural communities behind. There are no decentralized bodies that actually go in and take care of rural communities or local communities. That is the fundamental problem. Now, in their second point, they talk about debt deficit, and they say that this stresses on citizens. First of all, the United States has been spending and printing money since the 1970s pretty much indefinitely, and debt spending is actually helping these rural communities lift up. So what we've seen is that this actually doesn't affect the people, this idea that it's going to hurt people and gas prices are going up. Gas prices are going up for other reasons. Debt, they simply have not created an effective link chain between debt and these prices going up. Thank you.
Sorry about the POI. Too late. That's my bad. Is everyone ready?
Really quick before you start, so the hand is just like a POI?
Would you guys be better, or would it be better if like you just unmute and say POI? Is that more effective?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, just because like I don't always see it, like I don't see like the hand raised. But if you guys want us to use the hand, we can.
No, I think it's okay if you just unmute.
Okay, all right, sounds good.
All right. Okay, so a little off-time roadmap. My name is Sana Saxena. I'm the Gov second speaker. I'll be going over some contentions to the opposition case, and then I'll be restating some of our points and defending them. And 1 second, I have 8 minutes, and my time starts now. Hello, I'm Sana Saxena. I am the second speaker for the Gov side, and I would like to go through some of the opposition's points. So during their POI in my partner's first speech, they mentioned that rural groups in centralized governments are left behind, and are unable and are not helped by economic improvements that were cited as a facade when they were going against our case. Things like technological improvements, which were a facade. But what we would say as well is that in a lot of these federalist countries that are in massive debt, rural groups are also left behind, and that's largely because of like the debt is caused a lot of the times by rural groups and mass amounts of poverty, as well as we when an entire country improves and an economy and a GDP is growing, that means that like all the groups are improving simultaneously. GDP wouldn't grow at such a massive rate or be so high without like various groups improving at the same time. So that was a contention to their POI and their the second part of their first point. We'd also like to say that our point about centralized governments being able to change quickly due to efficient processes kind of went untouched. And then to their third point, or their second point, that federalist governments are prone to right-wing nationalism and breaches of human rights. They are insinuating that the U.S. or other federalized governments deal with these situations well, which we don't believe to be the case. Federalist state, such as Texas, has passed bills against LGBTQ people and trans people, which is human rights issues, and things like abortion are in jeopardy in a federalist government. And we don't think that a centralized government has anything to do with promoting those kinds of agendas or those points. It has nothing to do with if a government is centralized or not, if topics like that are pushed. And that was against their point about Hungary. And then when talking about rural areas and countries being and centralized governments leaving behind impoverished people, and specifically the point about climate change, the U.S., they said that California has, in their first point, been has been pushing climate change narratives, and nothing would be able to get done without that. But a major problem with California, and like Gavin Newsom, a main criticism with him and in a potential like presidential run, is that he hasn't been able to deal with homelessness and poverty very well in California. The biggest state in the U.S. has not been able to deal with that very well, and that's the main blotch on his resume. That the California can do all these good things, pushing agendas for climate change, but there's still a huge problem in the federalist system, which is poverty and homelessness that he hasn't been able to address. So despite, I agree, climate change is a big issue, but not all issues are like solved efficiently or even solved in a federalist system, which is kind of what the opposition side has been insinuating. And as well as when they say that rural groups are left behind in Japan and China, there's a lot of using rural and impoverished hand in hand, which we don't believe to be the case. Rural is a part of the country that is not urbanized. There's no city. That doesn't mean that it's impoverished. There's farmland, and there are parts of the U.S. that are farmland and would not be described as completely in poverty, which is the case in Japan and China. As my partner said, Japan grows the majority of their food, and they've been doing this for a long time. And this is a rural part where food is grown, farming is done. That doesn't mean that it's impoverished, because farming is actually a highly profitable business. And farmlands only flourish because of the freedom they have in a centralized government. They're able to work, as well as high GDPs in this country, which means that it's helping the rest of the country as well. So all these different groups, rural, farmland, cities, are all improving together. So I would like to go back through our points. So our definitions, the opponents described this house as a global institution, while we talked about it as specific countries that we described as this house. Centralized, they agreed, but they added on that states have no authority to pass their own laws, which is like the definition of centralized, but it's that centralized governments are still more efficient because there's less checkpoints to go through. That was our first point. And then, so our first point was that unity and efficiency is prioritized in a centralized government. And this was where the Japan example was used. And so unity and equality and consistency across regions, rural and non-rural, are more efficient because decisions are taken in through less checkpoints and concerning the whole nation. And so since this is the case, advancements are easier to come by, and policies are easier to be passed because everyone is on the same page, going in the like to improve. And then it's easier and faster for political reforms to be implemented, and avoids tensions between different governmental groups. As I said, each state has their own ideology. Texas can be against LGBTQ rights, while California can be supporting climate change, and this promotes disunity in the US. I think we've all seen it. Groups, wherever you go, groups are always fighting and bickering, and that is because of the state system that both geographically divides and ideologically divides all the groups in the US. And then our second point was that federalist countries are in massive amounts of debt. The US is in debt. The GDP ratio is over 100%, which is just terrible, and that also has a massive effect on homeless populations. That is my time. Thank you.
Okay, can everyone hear me all right? Okay, let me get a timer. Okay, so I'll just start my time on my first word. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to be doing is going over the affirmations case and their first argument, which was about faster reforms. They make the argument about more efficiency, and then they talk about Japan. So on the argument about more efficiency, there's a couple refutations to this. Number one, we value helping rural communities, helping to undo inequality over some efficiency to pass more urban technological growth policy. So they talk about efficiency. We actually don't see efficiency in policy for rural communities. BBC tells us that rural China has been historically disproportionately taxed and have received fewer benefits than the recent economic development from the recent economic development and success of China. We also see that in China's government, there is no single institution or formal mechanism in charge of integrating the most important rural policies. So we actually see less efficiency for policy to be passed to help communities that aren't necessarily boosting the GDP, or for communities that aren't necessarily helping the boosting the GDP or helping to grow technological development, but it still accounts for 36% of China's population. So we see that 36% of China's population has less efficient policies, and those people are disproportionately impacted. We see that those people who are poorer need to have more efficient policy, and that comes from having state and local governments. We see that under a Chinese system, we see less efficiency, and that is actually more harmful for a significant group of poorer communities. They say that we're inflating rural residents with poor people, which is not the same thing. But again, we read you evidence. We tell you that the annual per capita disposable income of rural residents is around $300 compared to 8,799 won for urban dwellers. Yeah, I'll take your PY.
Oh, thank you. I was just going to say, do you have any evidence of rural communities getting less efficient policy changes?
Yeah, so we see that China has like tried to have like rural policy passed to like lower disproportionate poverty. We see that those policies have been like completely lackluster at actually having an impact. We see that like China, like any policy that they've implemented, because they don't have like any formal mechanism to like integrate rural policies, we see that like all of those policies aren't actually held accountable by these rural communities. And so like they have like less of a say in like how it's actually adopted. And like that leads to more inefficiency. And so we've seen like a significant increase in, or we've seen an increase in poverty in rural communities compared to like more urban development communities. They say that like federalist countries also leave behind like rural communities, and that like they make a point about GDP debt being lowered and like that meaning that there's less poverty. So there's a couple responses to this. We see that again, like this argument about like GDP. We don't see that like GDP is actually there's a link between GDP and like the poverty of like average people. The International Growth Center says that an increasing GDP is often seen as a measure of increasing GDP is often seen as a measure of welfare and economic success. However, it fails to account for the multi-dimensional nature of development. It does not take into account rural and local development. So we see that like, although like, yes, a corporation may bring in more money, we don't actually see that like going to people going to these rural communities. So we don't see how GDP debt means that there's going to be less poverty. They also say like, sure, like federalist countries might also leave behind like rural communities at the federal level, but you see that you prefer a system in which like rural communities actually have representatives to push for policy at the federal level as compared to a centralized government. So you prefer a system in which there is some level of representation for these rural communities as compared to none at all, which means that most policy being passed, if policies pass at all, is going to be less efficient. Sure, like federalist countries might like have some disparities in rural versus urban development, but we see that A, it's worse in like more centralized governments, and B, you prefer a system of a federalist system where you have some form of representation. And you have some form of policy actually being able to be passed within that state or within that local government. Again, they talk about Japan. It's just more technology and like an increase in GDP doesn't mean it's actually going to help the people themselves. The second point they talk about was about debt. They say like debt is like greater in federalist systems, and that like a lower GDP debt means like better. It's better for the people. They make a point about gas prices going up. This is like, they don't actually link this together. It's not because of debt. We've been growing our debt since the 1970s, and like debt spending is essential to social programs. So we don't actually see this link being true. The New York Times says that the inflation and high gas prices are partly a result of fallout from the pandemic era and supply chain issues. And 52% of higher prices that people are feeling are a result of like corporate price gouging. So we see like profiteering from corporations rather than like debt. Gas prices has also been contributed to like the war in Ukraine and like OPEC reducing the amount of oil that it's producing. So we don't actually see how debt leads to higher gas prices. So going on to rebuild our case, our first point was about progressive policy. We talk about like a change. We talk about change at the federal level and how like it's less efficient. They say that like issues aren't solved in the federalist system, but again, like you prefer a world in which issues are at least partly solved and more significantly solved under a federalist system than under a centralized system. So like in the example of the United States, right? Like we see that there actually is some change being made at the state level in terms of climate change for like California, for example, as compared to like nothing at all. And they make the argument like US versus China, but like even if like US and China aren't doing, say, enough for climate change policy at the federal level, you prefer a world in which the states are able to pass more climate change policy, for example, in California, than nothing at all. Like we don't see like the same amount of like focus on climate change in China as we do in the United States within like state governments. So like, yeah, again, compare like China climate change policy to U.S. climate change policy. Although the federal governments might be doing as much as we would like, we still see something being done at the state level, which you prefer over nothing at all. They say, again, they make a refutation to our second point about low-income rural residents. They're saying we're conflating rural to impoverished. We're saying that there is a disproportionate amount of wealth inequality within these rural communities because there's less focus on them at the federal level. That's what we're saying. The second point we make about it is that of like it's vulnerable to right-wing nationalism. This is a very important point in today's debate. We see that like because of decentralized government in Hungary has been essentially able to rule by decree because there has been no like drawback from like the state and local governments or because of the centralized system. The BBC tells us that they contribute the alarming rise in limitations imposed by the alarming rise of like nationalism into like more centralized governmental systems. And so we see that like ruling by decree is worse than like the US system in terms of like freedom of speech and freedom of expression. Thank you.
All right.
Okay, can everyone hear me?
Yep.
Okay, so this, just for an off-time roadmap, I'm going to start with a couple of observations on top of case, and then I'll go into the voter issues. Okay. I'm going to start my time in 3, 2, and 1. Hello, Judge. My partner and I stand on the firmest negation of the resolution resolved. This House prefers a centralized government to a federal one. Let's start with a couple of observations, starting with the point about right-wing governments and specifically the vulnerability to right-wing nationalism in centralized governments. What's really, really important and what's been completely ignored by the affirmative today is that the very reason that Hungary has turned to right-wing nationalism and has been implementing this anti-human rights legislation at a national scale is because they had a centralized government. Understand that Prime Minister Viktor Orbán is only able to rule by decree because there was already a system in place in which there was no dissenting local government. No local government had any power in Hungary to tell Viktor Orbán no. No local government in Hungary or any of these other right-wing or other countries that have seen this rise in right-wing rhetoric, like Italy, like France, none of these countries had any sort of system in place where local governments could protect human rights. That is the fundamental problem. So understand at the end of the day that centralized governments uniquely have this problem. There's a reason why there's a fundamental difference between Hungary criminalizing homosexuality at a national level and Texas implementing an education bill that they try to bring up as a refutation. There's a fundamental difference. The vast majority of states in the United States are protect the human rights, the rights of people of the LGBTQ community. Understand that in Hungary, at a national level, homosexuality has been criminalized. There is a fundamental difference here. You prefer a system in which human rights are protected as opposed to a system in which there is no way to stop an authoritarian right-wing government. You prefer that system. But with that out of the way, let's go into the two voter issues today. The first point is going to be about progressive policy and low-income interests. What we have to understand is that the United States has a federal system in which local governments are able to take care of rural communities, in which local governments are able to pass policy that's going to help their communities. We give you the example of California's recent policy on electric cars. Again, what we have to understand is that California is only able to do that because California as a state, as a legislating body, exists. In these centralized governments, that doesn't exist. And there's a direct correlation between countries, in countries like China and Japan, they simply don't have this kind of rigorous policy on climate change. California sees that because they actually have power in the United States. This is very, very important. But further, we talk about low-income interests. We talk about how in countries like China and Japan, rural communities are left behind. They tell us that rural communities aren't poor, that we're conflating the two, but we tell you directly that in rural communities, there is disproportionate amounts of poverty. So we have to understand, again, that these communities are left behind. Again, in China's government, there is no mechanism that actually is accountable to these rural communities. In these, at the federal level or at the national level, they're just not accountable for helping rural communities. And because of that, they're left behind. There's disproportionate amounts of poverty. They're impoverished. There's a lack of good healthcare and education. These services are just not given to these communities. There's this facade of innovation that the affirmative touts throughout their speeches. But again, what good is this facade of innovation and technological growth if so many thousands or millions of people are being left behind? Again, in Japan, 10 million people account for the rural population in Japan. This is millions of people that are left behind because of the centralized governments. The second voter issue today is the vulnerability to right-wing nationalism. Now, the only way that they refute this point is by saying that they don't think that there's any sort of link between centralized governments and right-wing nationalism. This is just not true. The BBC, first of all, attributes this alarming rise to the limitations imposed by unitary and centralized governments. We give you the example of Viktor Orban in Hungary. The reason why he was able to amass this kind of right-wing power, this kind of centralized power, is because there were no local governments to say anything otherwise. For all of these reasons, Judge, you vote on the negation. Thank you.
Okay. Hi, Judge. I'm the final speaker in this debate. Excuse me, I have 5 minutes. And yeah, off-time roadmap. I'm going to go restate net benefit, go down some of their points. I should probably just go down all of their points and reaffirm ours at the very, very end. Yes, my time starts my first word. Okay, I'd like to reenact the fact that the opponents haven't contended our net benefit. Our net benefit was the benefit of the country. Instead, they took our net benefit. They said, we agree, and then we want to add on. And they only added on something. They actually kept it relatively the same. It's benefit to the country, not just rural communities. Like they're arguing only for the benefit of rural communities, what it sounds like in a sense. So I do want you to keep intact that it is benefit of the country itself, like which country gets the most benefit. 2, I'd like to bring up the fact that they dropped housing and cars. I meant they keep going on when I said that it increased gas prices, but they did not touch on the fact that that it increases housing prices and car costs and other costs of daily expenses. They dropped all of that because the only thing they had is gas prices because they try to link it to climate change. But I'd like to take the fact that focusing strictly on climate change it ignores everything else a government has to do. A government's responsibility is to take care of its people, get them money, get them opportunities, and then the people help that country. It is a system that helps each other. They have only mentioned the fact that, climate change bills haven't been passed in an efficient manner, but they've ignored the fact that bills on like housing prices have skyrocketed in the U.S. California's most expensive places to live. They've also ignored the fact that car prices have skyrocketed. People can't buy cars at an efficient rate now. They can't go to work and they can't get money, and therefore they fall into poverty. They've dropped all of this points. They haven't gotten a counter to it at all. 3, to bring up the fact that they give no evidence for rural policies. I asked them in the POI, like, did they have any examples of rural policy? And they just said, well, as we've seen, policies haven't really gotten, or they have been lackluster in their words to rural communities. I haven't heard an actual policy that was lackluster. So with that, I don't see what was lackluster about a policy if they didn't tell us what it was. Was it getting them more money? Was it getting them more access to land to grow the rice, which is the main thing in China that they grow? They haven't told us what policy was lackluster. And then now I'd like to go on the fact that they're equating Hungary to Russia. Hungary's not Russia. Hungary won't be Russia. It's much smaller, has less money. So that fact alone takes them to be very different countries. And 2, they talk about how they have nationally hated LGBTQ people. They do nationally hate LGBTQ people and ignore the fact that federalist countries all the time hate LGBTQ people. United States of America is a main example, has written in laws against LGBTQ plus community as a federalist society with multiple subunits of a national government. Like we said, Texas, Georgia, Alabama, Tennessee, all of these states or subunits of the national and federal level have hated LGBTQ people. Heck, in the California, one of the most positive, the most forward states in the United States, didn't have legal gay marriage until 2009, less than a decade ago, more maybe around a decade ago. This is a federalist country. That's still, yes, go for it.
The issue about gay marriage in California is a new argument.
All right, that's fair. Okay. But we did mention though, but Texas and Tennessee, other countries Texas rather, has anti-trans, anti-LGBTQ policies written into their laws. Now to go to say some of their points, they also said that poverty in China is really bad. It's worse in China than it is in the U.S. I also like to argue the fact that poverty is way worse for people living in a country that doesn't have the money to support them. In the United States, we do not have the money to support any homeless people or people of extremely low income compared to China, which literally has money. They could pay back their debt and have money to pay for their impoverished people. I also like to argue the fact that they said that there's no voice. They talk about a big thing is their voice. There's no voice for the impoverished. Who speaks for homeless people in our country and in the United States? No one speaks for homeless people. There's no voice for homeless people. There's no homeless people on any form of government. They don't have a voice. People above them speak for them just as they would in a centralist government. There's no difference to that. Therefore, that counters the point entirely of having a voice. I also like to go to the fact that they, like I said, reiterate the fact that the country's benefit is all growth. They've only mentioned the growth of certain sectors. We argue for the growth of every sector in a country, and this is all. And and then like to restate, this is our final restation of our point, is they didn't address the political polarization. Political polarization in federalist countries has gotten insane. There have been Proud Boys. The United States Capitol was attacked in a terrorist. That's kind of a new point, but they had dropped the political polarization point on how the United States and federalist countries have had immense amounts of polarization, and countries like China do not have this same polarization, which makes it easier for the people to live in that country. That's why, Judge, I heavily urge you to vote for the affirmation side of this debate.